Good morning, Mission Hills. How's it going? It is good to be here. My name is Dave Runyon. I'm going to spend the better part of the month with you. And this is a little bit of a homecoming for me. I grew up about a mile from here, over by Powell Middle School. Went to elementary school here in the area, and then junior high, and then I went to a year at Heritage High School. And then my family moved to the north, like the far north metro area. And I would tell you where they moved, but here's what I've learned about you people down here. My observation is that you think everything north of I-70 is Wyoming. Is that accurate? Yeah. So that I ended up serving up in that Wyoming area as a pastor for 10 years. I worked at two great churches, and then something happened to me that changed the trajectory of my life. I got obsessed with this one text. I was reading through John chapter 17. It's the last recorded prayer of Jesus as a free man. And in that chapter, he prays for himself, for what he's getting ready to go through. He prays for the disciples, and then he prays for all of us. He prays for every believer alive at that time, and then every believer to come. Does anybody know what he prays for in that moment? Unity. Nobody said it. I'm going to pretend like somebody said it over there. Get that participation connection thing going. Unity. Prays for unity. He says, God, may they be one. And he doesn't just pray for unity for the sake of unity. He prays for unity, and then he says, because when there's oneness among my people, in some beautiful, mystical, sacred way, people that don't know God get sucked towards him. And I started to stare at that passage and think to myself, what if this is actually true? I thought about all the different things I was involved in. What if one of the best ways for people who don't know God to come to know him is simply through the unity of us as believers? And I started to go to bed at night thinking about that passage. I started to wake up thinking about it. I started to hang out with other pastors up in Arvada, and we started to think, what would it look like if in one specific area of town we could leverage and join together with all of the other believers and to make the gospel tangible in our city? Could we actually act like we're on the same team? We are on the same team, but could we just act like it? And as we started to talk and to dream and to think together as leaders, we got really excited about this idea, and our group began to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. And one of the things that we realized early on was something pretty convicting. We didn't know our city, our community well enough to know this. What's the smartest thing that we could do together? We decided we were going to do local mission and serve people right in our own backyard, but we didn't know our city well enough to know what the best thing to do was. And so after we got over the humiliation of that, we started just to reach out to local civic leaders. And so we would meet with the police chief, and we met with the city manager, and 6.5 years ago, I was sitting in a room with the mayor of Arvada and 22 lead pastors. And we're sitting there in that room, and oftentimes we would ask all of these leaders a couple of questions. Number one, what's your dream for our city? And number two, if you could take a magic wand and wave it and change something about our community, what would you change? And whenever we asked that second question, we'd get out a little pen and paper, and we're going to write down, because we were like, this is it. We're going to figure out, what's the thing? So our mayor's there, and we told him what we were going to ask him, and he pulls out this piece of paper out of his back pocket, and he just starts reading down this list, and a lot of it was good. He's like, hey, I want to live in a city where there's no elderly shut-ins. I want to live in a community where there's no at-risk kids. There's no single moms who live below the poverty line. There's no financial debt. And there's some weird stuff on there too. He's like, hey, we need a better newspaper. We're like, this isn't the right room for that. We don't know how to help you with that, but so let's go back to all this other stuff. So he reads, it's 11 things deep. And we're sitting there writing, and then he takes this piece of paper and he puts it in his back pocket. And very much in passing, he just says, if you guys wanted to do the thing that would make the biggest difference, you should just start a neighboring movement with all of those people. And he just goes on to something. We're like, whoa, what? He said, yeah, we're just learning that the closer people are in relationship based on proximity, the less weight there is on all these programs that we're trying to provide for people in need. He said this incredible line. He said, the majority of the issues that our community is facing would be eliminated or drastically reduced if we could just become a city of great neighbors. We can go and build another Boys and Girls Club, or we could live on blocks in neighborhoods where those kids who need a healthy role model in their life are actually being sucked into and invited into families that are healthy. We can go and start another program for elderly shut-ins, or we could have a community in which those elderly people are becoming more and more isolated or actually connected through the people that live right next door. And he said this beautiful line. He said, what my friends and I are learning is that relationships always trump programs. Now, I want you to just imagine being in this room, okay? Just imagine for a second that you make your living helping people orient their lives around the text. Imagine being in that room. Imagine what it feels like when God uses your mayor to tell you that the smartest thing you can do is the thing that Jesus already said matters most. You know that love your neighbor idea? God used our mayor to say, hey, why don't you guys actually try that? It was a bad moment. It was a really bad moment. You ever get one of those metaphoric gut punches and you're like, ouch, but yet you feel like something profound is happening? That's what happened to us. And I'll never forget driving home that day. I'm driving back home I live kind of like on a little loop. And there's a couple things that are running through my mind. Number one, I had this thought. Jesus is smart. Yeah, it's not supposed to be like a new thought when you're a pastor. Jesus is a genius. Is it possible that when he gets asked to boil the entire text down to one thing, is it possible that Jesus has given us a simple strategic plan that if all of us did it, would actually change the world overnight? And then my second thought was this. I realized I wasn't doing it. I was driving back into my neighborhood thinking about the amount of time and effort that I was putting into relationships with the people that were right around me, and I just realized it was minuscule. Now, I was involved in a lot of really good things. As a pastor, I was involved with people's marriages, trying to help them figure out life with their kids. I was going and putting on like these outreach events, hoping that like maybe somebody that didn't know God would show up to them. I was sitting on the board of 3 different nonprofits. But I wasn't intentional at all about what was going on in my actual neighborhood. So I went into my house that day, and my wife, Lauren, is like ahead of me on most things, and certainly neighboring is one of them, and I told her what had happened, and we just made a commitment that day. We said, let's do an experiment. For 1 year, let's say no to a few things and just try to be a little bit more present. Let's try to spend a little bit more time in the front yard, and let's just look and see what doors open up. And I'm 6.5 years into that 1 year experiment, and it's screwed up my whole life. And I don't ever want to go back. It's like having kids for me, okay? Like it's really hard, and I don't ever want to go back. And I'm excited over the next few weeks. I'll share some stories with you about what's happened in my life, my family's life, and in the life of our neighborhood and in other neighborhoods. Let me tell you real quickly, though, what happened to that group of pastors and leaders. So we had that moment, we had that meeting, and we just said, let's pray. And we made a commitment to all come back in 2 months. And I'd been going around annoying city leaders with that magic wand question for a couple of years. There was this one lady, she was our assistant city manager, her name's Vicki Ryer, and everyone would go, oh, Vicki's like the person, she's the bridge between all the stuff, like the bureaucratic stuff and the ground. You should go talk to her. And Vicki would always tell me the same thing every time I asked her that question. She'd say, Dave, you know what you should do with all those people that show up to all those churches? Next time it snows, why don't you get them to shovel their neighbor's driveway? And when she would say that to me, I would just go, no, that's not it. Like I wanted something sexy. Like, we're going to change the city. We're going to, like, eradicate. You know, I was thinking in, like, these big terms. And so when the mayor said the neighboring thing, I just said, oh, no. Like, Vicki's been trying to tell me this for 2 years. And what I didn't, Vicki's the one who actually kind of, like, got the mayor to drink the Kool-Aid, too. And so she was the one behind this whole thing. So the next time we met, we invite Vicki to come in and meet with us. And she comes in and starts to share, like, hey, did you know that in neighborhoods where people know the first names of their neighbors, the crime rate's 80% less? Did you know that when there's a crisis, your neighbors are always your first responders because the systems are always overwhelmed? Do you know all the research that Malcolm Gladwell's done around the fact that people who know their literal neighbors live significantly longer? And the whole time we're sitting there going, wow, that's powerful, that's amazing, that's gold. And in the back of our minds, we're going, and Jesus said to do this. And then our whole little, what happened in our city got cemented in this one moment. At the very end, there's a little Q&A going on, and one of the pastors asked a question, and then Vicky responded and said, hey, like, you don't think from where we sit at the city level that we can see a noticeable, a drastic difference in the way Christians and non-Christians treat their actual neighbors, do you? And it felt so bad to hear somebody say that we started to argue with her about her perception. And then we just realized she's right. In our cities, there isn't a drastic, noticeable difference in the way Christians and non-Christians treat their actual neighbors. And here's how I know that. I've shared her quote in rooms with leaders from over 500 different cities, and never once has a civic leader ever come up to me and said, hey, Dave, in my city, the Christians are the best neighbors. It's not even close. And when we get honest with ourselves and we think about our own experiences, and we think about what happens in our country as a whole, we know that's true. There isn't a drastic difference in the way Christians and non-Christians treat their literal neighbors. And as I started to think about that just started how do we reconcile that Jesus says that if you only do one thing, love God with everything you have, love your neighbors yourself, how do we reconcile that with the fact that we're not known as the best neighbors in town? And as I started to think about that, you ever think about the way things are and you start to get angry? I'm sure in our current environment this wouldn't ever happen to you. But you see something on the news and it just makes you mad, irritated. That's what happened to me. I started to think about that. I'm like, something's wrong. And then I started to ask a different question. I started to ask a question that changed my posture. I started to ask, I wonder how you end up as a pastor who's not engaged in his own neighborhood. As I started to ask that question, I went from being irritated to reflective and convicted. And I started to read through the text. I started to read stories that I had read hundreds of times, that I had taught on multiple times, and they started to take on a whole new light. I want to share one of those with you today. It's found in Luke 10. You can turn there if you have a Bible. If not, we're going to have it up on the screen. I've come to believe that many of us are inoculated to the great commandment, especially those of us that have grown up in church. It's one of those things that we hear over and over and over again, but then somehow we lose touch with the true potency and the meaning of this teaching. Dallas Willard says that familiarity breeds unfamiliarity, and I think that's the case with what we're getting ready to look at here today. Luke 10:25. I want to invite you to look at this through a new lens. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law, he replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You've answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this, and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? This guy comes to Jesus, asks a really straightforward question. Jesus realizes this isn't what this is about. That's not what's going on here. This guy already knows the answer. And he does this a couple times throughout the Gospels. He says, hey, why don't you answer your own question? And the guy does it. And he gives the perfect textbook answer. And Jesus looks at him and says, you're right. That's it. And think about this line. Do this, and you will live. We'd spend the rest of our time just talking about that one phrase right there. But then look what happens in verse 29. And when I read this, it just stopped me. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Jesus, neighbor, what does that really mean? His first thought is, where's the loophole? How do I get out of this? And look at how he does it. I wonder if I can define the word neighbor, make it just fuzzy enough, just soft enough, so it can most easily fit into what I'm already up to. When I read this line, in order to justify himself, yes, Jesus, Who is my neighbor? I just saw I'm like, I'm that guy. Do you want to know how you can become a pastor who's not engaged in his own neighborhood? All you have to do is define the word neighbor so that it most easily fits into what you're already up to. Do you want to know how we can become a group of people who aren't distinguished by the way we treat our literal neighbors? Even though Jesus says, if you only do this, all you have to do is define the word neighbor, make it really big so it never really hits the ground. Just define it so it already fits into what you're already up to. And if you do that, let me tell you from personal experience what will happen. You'll end up with a really powerful, potent, metaphoric love for your metaphoric neighbors, and metaphorically, you'll be killing it. And in real life, you won't even know the names of some of the people that are sleeping 30, 40, 50 feet away from you. I know this because that's what happened to me. And I want to tell you this. If we have the courage to actually take the second half of the Great Commandment literally and seriously, to draw a circle around the places that God has put us and work out from there, powerful things happen. Not just to our neighbors, but also to us. Now, what Jesus does in this story is pretty fascinating. He looks at this guy, he goes, oh, you want to play this game? And he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, right? That's how he responds to his, who's my neighbor? Oh, I've got a story for you. Now, it's important to understand, because what Jesus does is he takes the definition of neighbor from here and he takes it to here. He just blows it up on this guy. But he's assuming that his audience and that this man, they're neighboring with the people of their same culture and customs. So he tells them this story, the story of the Good Samaritan. The big idea behind the story of the Good Samaritan is that everybody is my neighbor. That's actually not the big idea of that story. For most of my life, that's how I thought. I thought that's what the Good Samaritan story is all about, is that everybody's my neighbor. That's not what it says. It says, when you care for the person in front of you, you're being a neighbor to that person, even if it's a wounded terrorist. There's a big difference between when you care for the person in front of you, you're being a neighbor, to everybody's my neighbor. But that's how I thought about the story of the Good Samaritan. Everybody's my neighbor. And then check out this other little mental gymnastic move. You ready for this? You just think to yourself, I'm doing a lot of good stuff. I'm kind of just neighboring all the time. You like that? And I just drifted into a place in which I had to sit in a room and listen to this guy that God had put in authority in my community to be reminded that my neighbors, like maybe that's who Jesus is talking about too. And we started to dream as pastors and leaders about what would it look like for us to go and to make all of the people who come to our churches feel the same like horrible feelings that we felt in all those moments with the mayor and the city manager, right? And we didn't want them to feel horrible shame, but we did feel this sense of conviction and we wanted to share it. And so we all put aside our own agendas. And for a month, we shared with every one of our congregations. And we just asked this question: what if Jesus meant our actual neighbors too? And we fell backwards into this little exercise, this little thing that I want to do with you today because it had such an incredible impact in my city. And so I'm going to do a little quiz with you here this morning. You ready for this? Right in front of you, there's like a note that says sermon notes. Right in front of you. Take out that pad. There's one there for every two people, and a pen. Some of you are like, wow, there's sermon notes here. So take out a pen. If you were part of the small group summer study, you did this 2 years ago, so this would be like a quiz for you. If you weren't, this is going to be a test. I want you to actually do this with me. I want you to draw a tic-tac-toe board on that little piece of paper. Now I want you to imagine, you're in the middle, I want you to imagine you walk outside your apartment, your condo, your home, whatever it is. Imagine the 8 closest units to you. You got them? I just want you to write down the names of the adults that you know in those 8 units. Let's go ahead and we'll take a minute here to do that. Like you're cheating, you're talking to your spouse. Put real people's names, like don't put annoying lady. dude who drives blue car. When I did this for the first time, I could do 2 of these. I do both adults' names in 2 of these boxes. And then I felt bad, and so there's like somebody I knew like 15 houses away, and so I just like jacked their name in here too to make myself feel better. Don't do that. Just like let this whole moment sink in for you. How many of you can name the adults in all 8 of those houses? Like right now, I might call you up here, so don't feel weird if I do that. 10% of the room, I'm going to be generous. How many of you right now, 5 or more, you can get all 5 or more, both adults in any of those houses? Raise up your hand. 30% of the room. We've done this little exercise now with over 200,000 people. I want to tell you something. I've never been in a room of Christians where more than half of the room can write down more than half of their neighbors' names. I've never been in a room of Christians where more than half of the room can write down their neighbors' names. Let me tell you why I think this is important. My friend Jay, who's a pastor up in Arvada, likes to say this: in order to love someone, it's helpful to know their first name. I'll tell you what happened on my block. My wife took out a napkin. She drew a tic-tac-toe board on it. She put it on our fridge. There's all kinds of stuff on my fridge that I just never look at. It's just white noise. But I had this moment, got it done something, and I said, you know what, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna fill in the rest of those boxes. And I was sitting out a couple of days later in my driveway. I was actually standing there. I can remember this like it was yesterday. And if you give yourself to this, you're gonna have a moment like this in the next week. I'm standing there in my driveway, and I look over, and my neighbor is over there, up and over one. He's mowing his lawn. And I think to myself, I'm like, yeah, I said I was gonna do this. I'm gonna go introduce myself, his name. And then I thought to myself, that's pretty weird, man. Like, while he's mowing his lawn. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to make up something to do in the front yard when he gets done. I'm like, that's more weird. And I thought to myself, I'll go back inside, and I bet when I come out, he'll be getting done. And just like Don, like I'm just trying to get out of it. So I sat there, and I took that first step down the driveway, and I started walking down. I just kept my head down, because I'm like, this is going to be super awkward. And then I kind of looked up out of my head, and he's mowing his lawn. He's looking at me. He's like, what are you doing? You're not running at me. This is not an emergency. What's happening? I just kept my head down. I walked up his driveway, and he stopped. And I said, hey, man. That was my name for him. My other neighbor was Bro, and I kept them totally separate. And I thought that was like really, I was pretty proud of myself. I said, hey, this is really embarrassing. I've lived next to you for 18 months. I've met you 3 times, and I don't know your name. See, for me, actually doing this was just about eating crow. I'd met all my neighbors. They just weren't important enough for me to remember and retain their names. We had like a 20-second conversation. He's like, Matt, my wife's Jan, and we just talked for a minute. And I walked back into my house, and I did something incredibly important. I just wrote it down. And God did something to me. Like that little chart, this little block map, all of a sudden, these went from people who just have certain types of cars and a certain number of kids that do certain things, to like real people with real names and real stories. And they started getting inside of my thoughts and my prayers. And it went from, hey, Matt, to, hey, Matt, did you see the ending of that game last night? Was that incredible? To, hey, Matt, I've got this thing in my garage. I just need to move it like 30 feet. Could you help me? To, hey, you guys are going to be watching the game. We're going to watch. Let's just come over. Let's just throw something on the grill. To, hey, I saw your son's car is back a lot now. Did he move back in? How's that going? To sitting across a dining room table, sharing at depth about the things that have shaped us, the things that we love, the things that we believe. Conversation that is dreaming about having, thirsting about having with people like him. And it never happens if you don't learn their name. And from the show of hands that I just saw, I would tell you this, like for many of us in this room, the next step is just to simply say, I'm willing to go and have that type of conversation. I'm willing to go and at least learn and retain and use somebody's name. Learning somebody's name it's a big deal. You get disproportionate result for just learning somebody's name. They go from being a stranger to an acquaintance. And oftentimes it's just like stepping onto this moving sidewalk. You step onto it and it just starts taking you down the road. So much of momentum is just getting going, taking out that first obstacle and getting it out of the way. And that's what this did to me. It helped me just take out that first obstacle. Now, I want to tell you something. Some of my neighbors don't want to be my friends. Some of my neighbors are really busy, and they just want to get home and get that garage door up and get their car in and get the garage door down and detox from their day and then wake up and do it over and over and over again. And I have a lot of grace for that because that's how I lived most of my life. But some of my neighbors are dying for relationship. All they have is these weird surface things at work and then these weird dysfunctional things in their family, and they're dying for somebody to just lean in just a little bit more with. And all it took was doing a few simple things, taking a couple of small steps over and over again. I love the 3D1 model that you guys use here at the church because it's all about taking big picture stuff and making it really concrete, identifying the next step. What if you just went and said, I'm going to learn these people's names and I'm going to use their names when I see them? What if, that couple you've been saying you want to have over for 2 years, what if you actually had them over? What's the next small step that God's calling you to take? I'm really excited about what's happening here at this church on a number of levels. I'm excited that the leadership here believes in this. That they're saying, this is the kind of church we want to be. We want to start something here that spreads out in this entire community. Well, here's the great news. We're not setting the bar high. Everybody taught me when I was growing up, you know what good leaders do? They set the bar high. Then either people get close to it or they get over it. Maybe that's true with a small team. Let me tell you what I've learned about movements. The key, if you want to start a movement, isn't to set the bar high. The key is to set the bar so low that people can't crawl underneath it. I'm going to tell you what we're getting ready to do here today is we're getting ready to set that bar that low. Would you be willing just to make a commitment to learn, retain, and use the names of the people around you? And if you would, the church bought a magnet for every household here. So as you walk out of here today, you can grab one of these. If you're willing to do that. If you're willing to actually take literally the thing that Jesus said matters the most. I've learned this almost every time when I tell my story. There's a certain percentage of the room that's thinking something along these lines. Hey, Dave, I spend way more time at work than I do in my neighborhood. And you know what? That's actually neighboring, and you're not counting that. And that's bad exegesis by you, or whatever it is. Hey, Dave, you know what I'm doing with the parents on my kids' soccer team? I am pouring hours and hours of time into them, and I'm nurturing that relationship. That's neighboring. Dave, I'm getting ready to go on this trip to Poland, and we're going to care for these kids, and that's neighboring. I know it is because Jesus said it is. And so if you've had that thought, or if you found your mind maybe going there a little bit, I want to tell you something. You're 100% correct. You're exactly right. That is clearly in Jesus' book. That is neighboring. But here's the deal. All of that doesn't somehow make your actual neighbors not who Jesus was talking about. And I lived most of my life doing all this stuff over here, and then I was acting like somehow magic fairy dust got sprinkled over my neighborhood, and that because I was doing all this stuff, Jesus wasn't talking about them. Now, when you say it out loud, you're like, that's a really sick thought. That's horrible thinking. But I got there, and I lived there for a long time. And I want to tell you this. When you start to base relationships on proximity, big things happen. Proximity-based relationships are a lot different than affinity-based relationships. Proximity-based relationships, you don't choose those people. right? And they're always there. It's like they never leave. Like I go away and I come back and they're still there. And when I melt down on my kid and have a bad moment, they're there. And when I have a good moment, they're there too. There's something really sacred about proximity-based relationships, and I think it's part of the genius of the Great Commandment. I'm going to share a text with you that's going to frame our entire series here. It's in Acts 17. We'll talk about this a little bit each of these weeks. Paul is talking about God. From one man, so God made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. There's something sacred going on right outside your front door. God placed you there. He's placed the people around you there. And if you believe this, if you give yourself to this text, it will ruin you. It'll change the way you drive out of your neighborhood and change the way you drive in your neighborhood. You'll start becoming awakened to the fact that like what we do in our front yard counts. It's real ministry. And so I'm excited for what's going to happen here over the next few weeks. I'm excited. We're going to have kind of a little learning lab. And so this first week, I just want to ask you, would you be willing to go learn at least one new name? Would you be willing to have like a weird conversation with somebody and then just write it down? Would you be willing just to do that this week? One of my friends put it this way, just said, in this life we can only do a few things really well. I think it'd be important to make sure that one of those is the thing that Jesus said matters most. Would you pray with me? God, thanks for giving us this incredible command that has the potential to do so much for us and for the people that live around us. God, give us a passion, a desire to take the Great Commandment literally and seriously. Help us to make the time to build relationships with the people that you have placed around us. God, give us the courage to live the kind of lives that you want us to live. In your name, amen.